There are people you will meet in life who do not arrive as storms, but as soft winds that slowly change the direction of your peace. They will not always look harmful, and they will not always sound unkind, yet something in your spirit will feel smaller in their presence. And if you are not careful, you may begin to call that discomfort normal, even familiar. But life has a quiet wisdom it offers to those who are willing to listen. Not every hand that reaches toward you is meant to lift you, and not every voice that speaks your name is speaking truth. Tonight we step into a difficult but necessary truth about the kinds of people who do not deserve the fullness of your trust or the weight of your respect, no matter how close they may stand to your life. There are people who will stand in front of you with a smile so calm, so practiced, that you begin to mistake it for safety. Their words may sound gentle, even supportive, and their presence may feel familiar enough to lower your guard. But not every smile is born from kindness. Some are carefully worn like masks, designed not to reveal what is truly happening behind the eyes. And it is often in those quiet contradictions, where warmth appears on the surface but tension moves underneath, that you begin to understand a painful truth about human nature. These are the ones who will speak your name with sweetness when you are present, yet reshape your story when you are absent. They will listen to your dreams, not to protect them, but to measure how they might one day be broken. They do not always act with loud cruelty. Instead, they move with subtle precision, choosing moments when you are most open, most trusting, most unaware. And because their harm is not always immediate, it becomes easier to ignore, easier to excuse, until the pattern reveals itself too late. You may even find yourself questioning your own intuition in their presence. You may wonder if you are being too sensitive, too guarded, too suspicious, but there is a wisdom within you that does not need permission to speak. It whispers through discomfort, through hesitation, through the small tightening in your spirit when something does not align. And if you learn to honor that whisper, you will begin to see that false warmth has a distinct texture. It feels like being seen, but never truly known. The danger of such people is not only in what they do, but in what they cause you to doubt. They do not simply betray trust, they slowly erode your ability to recognize betrayal. And once that erosion begins, you may start offering access to your life in places where boundaries should have stood firm. You may begin to call their presence normal, even necessary, because familiarity often disguises itself as loyalty. But truth, though quiet, is never absent. It waits for your awareness. It asks you to observe not just how people speak to you, but how they move when you are not looking. It asks you to notice whether their kindness remains consistent when there is nothing to gain. And in that observation, you begin to reclaim something essential, your right to discern between genuine care and carefully constructed illusion. And when you finally see the difference clearly, you no longer confuse charm for character. There are people who will step into your life with a warmth that seems timely, almost perfect, as if their arrival is guided by care rather than convenience. They will speak to you with familiarity that feels earned over years, even when the connection has barely been built. At first, you may feel chosen, valued, even needed in a way that feels comforting. But over time, a pattern begins to reveal itself quietly, not through dramatic moments, but through repetition that becomes harder to ignore. They are present when something is required, when assistance is needed, when your strength, time, or attention becomes useful to them. In those moments, their words flow easily, their appreciation feels abundant, and their interest in you seems alive. Yet when the need fades, so does their presence. The silence they leave behind is not loud, but it carries a weight that begins to speak for itself. It tells you what their words never openly admit, that their closeness was never rooted in connection, but in convenience. You may find yourself trying to understand the shift, searching for reasons that excuse the distance. Perhaps you tell yourself they are busy, distracted, overwhelmed by life. And sometimes that may be true, but truth has a way of revealing itself through patterns rather than isolated events. When someone only remembers you in moments of benefit and forgets you in moments of ordinary existence, it becomes less about circumstance and more about intention. The difficult part is that these connections often begin with just enough sincerity to feel real. They may laugh with you, listen to you, even share small pieces of themselves that create the illusion of depth. But true connection does not appear only when it is useful. It does not turn on and off like a light dependent on need. It remains steady, even in silence, even in absence of advantage. And so you begin to notice the emotional imbalance. You are left giving more than you receive, showing up more consistently than they do, holding space for someone who only enters your space when it benefits them. Slowly, without realizing it, you start to question your own worth, wondering why your presence is not enough to keep someone near unless there is something to gain. But understanding this truth is not a loss. It is a return to clarity. Because once you see that some people are drawn not to you, but to what you provide, you begin to value your presence differently. You begin to recognize that love, respect, and connection are not supposed to feel transactional. They are not meant to arrive only in moments of need and disappear in moments of ease. And in that recognition, something powerful happens. You stop measuring your value by how often you are needed and start understanding the difference between being wanted for who you are and being used for what you offer. There are people who will sit beside you as you speak about your dreams, nodding politely, even smiling at the innocence of your vision. Yet somewhere beneath that calm surface, something in them tightens. They may not always show it directly, but their words begin to shift, subtly at first, wrapped in logic that sounds reasonable. They will tell you to be realistic, to slow down, to reconsider, as if ambition itself were a danger rather than a direction. And what they often call advice is sometimes nothing more than discomfort wearing the language of concern. They do not always mock you with open laughter. Sometimes it is quieter than that. It is in the tone that lowers just slightly when you speak with hope. It is in the pause that lingers after you share something meaningful to you. It is in the way they redirect your excitement toward limitation, as though protecting you from disappointment when, in truth, they are protecting themselves from the sight of your growth. Because your rise forces them to confront a question they are not ready to answer within themselves. It is easier for them to shrink your dream than to examine their own silence. Easier to question your path than to walk toward their own. And so, they disguise hesitation as wisdom and fear as guidance. They may even believe they are helping you, because insecurity has a way of convincing people that limitation is safety. But not every voice that corrects you is a voice that understands you. And if you listen closely, you will notice something else. The people who truly see you do not rush to diminish your vision. They may challenge you, yes, but they do not aim to erase the fire behind your words. They do not make you feel foolish for imagining more than what currently exists. Instead, they remind you, quietly and steadily, that growth is allowed, even when it is uncertain. The challenge, then, is not only to recognize those who mock your dreams, but to understand why it affects you so deeply. Because when someone dismisses what you are becoming, it can make you question whether you are allowed to become it at all. And that is where the real danger lies. Not in their doubt, but in how easily their doubt can become your hesitation. But dreams are not fragile things meant to survive only in approval. They are meant to be tested, refined, and sometimes even protected from the voices that cannot yet understand them. And there comes a moment when you realize that not every opinion deserves access to your direction. Not every hesitation deserves a place in your confidence. And when that realization settles within you, you begin to move differently, not louder, not angrier, but clearer. You stop explaining your vision to those committed to misunderstanding it. And in that silence, your path becomes your own again. There are moments in life when trust is not broken, loudly but quietly, like something slipping through your hands before you even realize you were holding it. It begins with a choice someone makes, a boundary they cross, a promise they fail to keep, a line they were fully aware of, yet decided to step over anyway. In that moment, something within you shifts, even if you do not immediately name it. You try to understand it, explain it, soften it, because the human heart often prefers meaning over pain, even when meaning becomes an excuse for what should not be repeated. And then comes the apology. Sometimes it is sincere in tone, sometimes carefully crafted, sometimes emotional enough to make you question your own reaction. They may speak of regret, of misunderstanding, of circumstances that led them there. And in that space between hurt and healing, you are asked, directly or indirectly, to make room for them again, to believe that what happened was an exception, not a reflection. So you forgive, not always because the action deserves it, but because you hope the person does, because you remember the version of them that felt different, safer, closer to what you believed they could be. And forgiveness in itself is not weakness. It can be strength, clarity, even grace. But forgiveness without awareness slowly becomes a doorway that never fully closes. What is often left unspoken is that trust, once broken, does not return in its original form. It may rebuild, it may adapt, it may even grow more cautious, but it is never exactly the same. And yet some people do not respect that change. They return not with transformation, but with expectation. Expectation that you will forget. Expectation that you will restore what they chose to disrupt. Expectation that your boundaries will soften simply because time has passed. And when they are met with resistance, they may not understand why you are no longer as open, as immediate, as giving. They may call you distant, cold, unforgiving. But what they often fail to recognize is that repeated betrayal is not a single mistake living in isolation. It is a pattern that teaches the heart how to protect itself. There is a quiet wisdom in learning that access must be earned consistently, not reclaimed through apology alone. Because someone who truly values your trust does not treat it as something infinitely renewable after damage. They become more careful with it, not more entitled to it. And as you grow through these experiences, something shifts in your understanding. You begin to see that second chances are not obligations, they are choices. And those choices must be guided not only by hope for who someone might become, but by honesty about who they have repeatedly chosen to be. In that understanding, you stop confusing mercy with permission. And you begin to recognize that protecting your peace is not the absence of forgiveness, but the presence of self-respect. There are people whose presence does not arrive with peace, but with a quiet exhaustion that builds slowly over time. At first, you may not even recognize it as something external. You may think it is your own tiredness, your own mood, your own sensitivity to life. But then you begin to notice a pattern. After certain conversations, you feel heavier. After certain encounters, your thoughts feel scattered. After certain presences, your energy feels less like something shared and more like something taken. They do not always take in obvious ways. There is no clear moment where something is stolen, no single action you can point to with certainty. Instead, it happens through repetition. Through conversations that revolve endlessly around their problems, but rarely acknowledge your own. Through emotional dependence that leans on you, but does not hold you when you need support in return. Through attention that flows in one direction, until you begin to feel like a space for release rather than a person with needs of your own. At first, you may call it loyalty, you may call it patience, you may call it understanding, because you were taught that being there for people is a virtue. And it is, but even virtue loses its meaning when it becomes one-sided sacrifice. There is a difference between compassion and depletion, between being present for someone and being consumed by their presence. What makes it even more difficult is that these connections are not always harmful in intention. Some people do not realize the weight they place on others. Some are simply used to taking without noticing what it costs. But impact does not depend on intention alone. Your energy does not distinguish between what was meant and what was done. It only responds to what it experiences. And so, over time, you begin to feel a quiet shift within yourself. Things that once felt light begin to feel effortful. Your patience shortens. Your silence becomes more frequent, not because you have changed in essence, but because something within you is trying to protect itself from constant depletion. That protection is not coldness, it is awareness forming itself into boundaries. There comes a point where you start to understand that not every relationship is meant to be sustained at the cost of your inner balance. Some connections are not built to be carried indefinitely. Some presences are not meant to stay close if they only exist in your life as a constant emotional weight. And when you begin to recognize that, you also begin to see your energy differently. You realize it is not infinite in the way you once assumed. It is something valuable, something directional, something that deserves reciprocity, not just release. You begin to understand that giving without replenishment is not love, it is erosion. And in that realization, you learn a quiet but powerful truth. Your life does not become fuller by how much you endure, but by how wisely you choose what and who you continue to carry. There are people who speak of loyalty as if it is something fixed, something solid, something unbreakable by time or circumstance. They use the word easily, comfortably, almost as if it belongs to them by default. In their presence, you may begin to believe them, because their words are shaped in a way that sounds familiar to what you hope loyalty should be. But over time, you begin to notice that their loyalty does not stand in one place. It moves, it adjusts, it shifts direction depending on where benefit flows more easily. When things are simple, when there is something to gain, when your presence is useful, their closeness feels steady. They are available, responsive, even attentive in ways that create the illusion of reliability. But when the dynamic changes, when convenience fades, when effort is required instead of access, something subtle happens. Their energy changes first, then their attention, then their presence itself begins to withdraw. Not always completely, not always permanently, but enough for you to notice a pattern that cannot be ignored. You may find yourself questioning it at first. Perhaps you think you are imagining it. Perhaps you think you are expecting too much. Perhaps you even adjust yourself to maintain what feels like connection. That is often how imbalance survives for longer than it should, through the willingness of one side to adapt endlessly, while the other only adjusts when it is comfortable to do so. And in that space, you begin to understand something important about the nature of convenience disguised as loyalty. It does not stay still when tested. It does not remain consistent when effort is required without reward. It is present when it is easy and absent when it is not. And though it may return again when circumstances shift back in its favor, it never fully offers the stability that true loyalty carries. Real loyalty does not calculate its presence. It does not wait for advantage before it shows care. It does not measure relationships in terms of usefulness. Instead, it remains anchored, even when convenience is absent, even when benefit is not immediate, even when the moment does not serve personal interest. But when you encounter those whose loyalty shifts like weather, you begin to see how easily words can be separated from truth. And that realization, though uncomfortable, becomes a form of clarity. It teaches you to observe consistency rather than promises, presence rather than intention, action rather than language. There is a quiet strength that develops when you finally stop confusing availability with loyalty. You begin to notice who stays steady when there is nothing to gain. You begin to understand who remains when convenience is no longer part of the equation. And in that understanding, you no longer chase consistency from those who have never practiced it. Instead, you begin to value the rare kind of loyalty that does not move with benefit, but remains rooted in character. There are people who do not reveal themselves through what they say, but through what they choose not to say. You may notice it first in moments of struggle, when life feels uncertain and your steps are not as steady as you would like them to be. In those moments, certain voices become louder, more present, more attentive. They ask questions that seem concerned, but carry a tone that is more observant than supportive. They watch your setbacks closely, not always with open harm, but with a quiet interest that does not feel entirely kind. And then there are the other moments, the ones that should feel different, the moments when something in your life moves forward, even slightly, a success, a breakthrough, a small victory that still matters deeply to you. You expect, perhaps without even realizing it, that the same presence that once observed your difficulties would now acknowledge your growth. But instead, there is silence. Not always absence, not always distance, but a carefully placed quiet that does not match the energy of your achievement. That silence can be confusing at first. You may question whether you are expecting too much. You may tell yourself that not everyone expresses happiness the same way. And that is true. But there is a difference between reserved expression and emotional absence. There is a difference between someone who is quietly proud and someone who simply does not step forward when joy is present in your life. What makes this even more difficult to understand is that the same people may have been fully present in your lower moments. They may have noticed your struggle quickly, responded to your difficulty, and engaged with your challenges in ways that felt immediate. But when the direction shifts, when your life moves upward instead of downward, their engagement does not always follow the same pattern. It fades into distance that is not always spoken, but deeply felt. Over time, you begin to recognize that attention is not always neutral. It can be selective. It can be shaped by emotional comfort, by comparison, by internal insecurity that is not openly acknowledged. Some people find it easier to engage with you when you are struggling than when you are succeeding, because your struggle allows them to feel stable, while your success forces them to confront something within themselves. And so silence becomes its own kind of communication, not always intentional, not always malicious, but still revealing. It shows you where energy flows naturally and where it stops when admiration is required instead of observation. It shows you who participates in your journey fully and who only steps forward when the direction does not challenge their sense of place. But the deeper lesson is not about them alone. It is about what you learn to recognize in yourself through these patterns. You begin to understand that genuine support does not change its presence based on your position in life. It does not only observe you when you are falling, it also acknowledges you when you are rising. And in that understanding, you no longer rely on silence to define your worth. You begin to measure connection not by who watches your struggle, but by who respects your growth enough to stand with it when it happens. There are people who will encounter your kindness and quietly begin to reshape it into something it was never meant to be. They will watch how you respond with patience, how you choose understanding over reaction, how you offer grace even when it is not returned. And instead of recognizing the strength it takes to remain that way, they begin to see it as an opening, an opportunity to take more than they give, to push further than they should, to exist in your space without ever fully honoring it. At first, their actions may not feel intentional. They may simply ask for more of your time, more of your attention, more of your emotional presence. And because giving comes naturally to you, you may not question it. You may believe that this is what connection requires, that to care deeply means to extend yourself without measure. But slowly, the balance begins to shift. What was once appreciated becomes expected, and what was once offered freely becomes something they assume will always be there. They begin to rely on your understanding in moments where accountability should exist. They begin to lean on your forgiveness in places where change should have taken root. And in doing so, they are no longer meeting your kindness with respect. They are reshaping it into something that serves their comfort. What they call your good nature becomes, in their eyes, a reason not to adjust their own behavior. And this is where the quiet harm begins. Not in loud disrespect, but in repeated disregard. In moments where your needs are overlooked because you have been the one who always understands. In situations where your silence is mistaken for agreement, when in truth it is simply restraint. Over time, you may begin to feel the weight of being seen, not as a person with limits, but as a source that does not run dry. You may even question yourself in the process, wondering if asking for balance makes you less kind, less patient, less of who you have always tried to be. But there is a difference between being compassionate and being consumed. One honors both you and the other person. The other slowly removes you from the equation entirely. What they fail to see is that kindness is not weakness. It is a choice made again and again, often in moments where it would be easier to close off. It is guided by awareness, not absence of strength. But when someone chooses to misunderstand that, they reveal more about their own limits than yours. And as this understanding deepens within you, something begins to change. Not in your nature, but in your boundaries. You begin to recognize that kindness does not require you to remain in spaces where it is not respected. It does not ask you to continue giving where there is no intention to reciprocate. It does not demand that you prove your goodness by how much you can endure. And in that realization, you reclaim something essential. You begin to offer your kindness with intention, not obligation. You begin to protect it, not with hardness, but with clarity, because when softness understands its own worth, it no longer bends to be accepted. It stands quietly and firmly in its truth. There are people who will stand beside you in seasons where you are still learning yourself, still uncertain, still willing to bend in ways that make connection easier to maintain. In those moments, everything feels balanced, familiar, even comfortable. They recognize you in that version, and in many ways they come to depend on it. Not always because they intend harm, but because it asks nothing of them. It allows them to remain exactly as they are. But growth does not ask whether others are ready. It begins quietly within you. It changes the way you think, the way you respond, the way you allow yourself to be treated. And as those changes take shape, something subtle begins to shift in your relationships. What once felt natural may now feel misaligned. What once felt easy may now require you to ignore parts of yourself you have worked hard to understand. And this is where resistance begins to appear. Not always in direct opposition, but in small, persistent ways. They may question your decisions, not out of curiosity, but out of discomfort. They may remind you of who you used to be, as if that version holds more value than who you are becoming. They may even suggest that you are changing too much, when in truth you are simply changing in ways that no longer accommodate their stillness. What they often do not realize is that their expectation is not neutral. To ask someone to remain the same for the sake of comfort is to quietly ask them to stop evolving. It is to prefer familiarity over authenticity, ease over truth. And while that may preserve the relationship on the surface, it does so at the cost of something deeper, your alignment with yourself. You may feel the tension of that expectation, the pull to remain recognizable, to not disrupt what has always been. There may be moments where you consider stepping back into old patterns, softening your growth just enough to keep the peace. Because there is history there, and history has a way of making us feel responsible for maintaining what once worked. But there is a quiet understanding that begins to take root within you. That real connection does not require you to abandon your growth. It does not ask you to shrink so that it can remain comfortable. It does not depend on your willingness to stay the same in order to survive. Instead, it expands with you, even if that expansion takes time to understand. Those who refuse to grow will often struggle to walk beside someone who is evolving, not because your path is wrong, but because it reflects a movement they have chosen not to make. And rather than facing that stillness within themselves, it becomes easier to question your direction. But you are not here to remain unchanged for the sake of being accepted. You are here to become fully and honestly, even if that becoming creates distance where closeness once lived. And when you accept that, something within you steadies. You stop negotiating your growth to preserve what no longer fits. You stop explaining your evolution to those committed to misunderstanding it. And in that quiet certainty, you begin to move forward, not away from people, but toward a version of yourself that no longer needs permission to grow. There are people who will not question your worth directly, but will slowly lead you to question it yourself. It does not happen all at once. It begins in small moments, subtle remarks, comparisons that feel unnecessary, silences where encouragement should have lived. They may not openly tear you down, but they rarely build you up. And over time, that absence begins to echo louder than any words ever could. You may find yourself seeking their approval without realizing when it started, adjusting your tone, your choices, even your identity in small ways, hoping to feel seen, hoping to feel enough in their presence. But the more you reach, the more distant that sense of validation becomes. Because some people do not withhold affirmation by accident. They create a space where you are always almost enough, but never fully there. And in that space, something begins to shift within you. You start to measure yourself through their responses. You begin to second-guess your instincts, to question your decisions, to wonder if the things that once felt certain about you were ever true at all. It is not that you have lost your worth, it is that you have been standing too long in an environment that does not reflect it back to you. What makes this especially difficult is that these people are not always harsh. Sometimes they are calm, composed, even present in ways that make you believe they care. But care without encouragement, presence without support, connection without affirmation, these things slowly create a quiet erosion, not loud enough to force you away, but steady enough to change how you see yourself. You may begin to work harder for their recognition, to prove yourself in ways that go unnoticed, to show your value in hopes that it will finally be acknowledged. But worth is not something that should have to be proven repeatedly in the same space. It is something that should be recognized, respected, and reflected back with honesty.